The sun had barely lifted above the horizon and the desert stretched endlessly, wide, silent, and golden. Every grain of sand sparkled like a secret waiting to be found. The wind carried the dry scent of cactus and sage, brushing over the red rocks that had stood for centuries. It was a place where time moved slowly, and men often came chasing dreams they never caught. Among those dreamers rode Luke McAllister, a cowboy with a weathered hat and a heart full of restless hope. His horse, a sturdy brown mare named Dusty, trotted steadily through the open plains. Luke's eyes were sharp but tired, the kind of tired that didn't come from lack of sleep, but from carrying too many worries. He had been traveling for weeks, moving from one small town to another looking for work or maybe something he couldn't name. The promise of gold had drawn him to the Arizona desert. People in the saloons talked about it like it was magic, gold hidden deep in the Apache lands, gold that could change a man's life forever. Luke had nothing left to lose. The idea of finding that treasure felt like his only chance at freedom. But the desert wasn't kind. Days were hot enough to burn the skin and nights were cold enough to freeze the bones. Water was scarce and loneliness hung heavy around him. Luke had seen men lose themselves out here, not just to thirst or hunger, but to silence. Yet even in that silence, he kept going. He wasn't the kind to quit, not after all the roads he had ridden. That morning, the sky began to darken in a strange way. A wall of sand rose on the horizon, curling upward like a giant beast. Luke's heart raced. It was a sandstorm, fierce and sudden. He pulled his bandana over his face, held onto Dusty's reins, and searched for shelter. The wind howled, throwing dust into his eyes, biting at his skin. The world turned into a blur of brown and gold. He could barely see, but he pressed forward, hoping to find cover behind the rocks ahead. Minutes felt like hours. The storm roared with no mercy. When it finally passed, Luke and Dusty stood coated in dust, trembling and exhausted. He patted his horse's neck softly, whispering, "We made it, girl." But his voice faded when he noticed something unusual near a cluster of boulders. Something small, lying still against the ground. Curiosity and concern pushed him closer. At first, he thought it was just a bundle of cloth left behind by a traveler. But then he saw it move slightly. It was a young girl, no more than 16 or 17. Her dark hair tangled with sand, her skin pale under the layer of dust. Her clothes were woven with beautiful beadwork, and Luke realized instantly she was Apache. For a moment, he froze. He had heard stories in every town about the Apache, some filled with fear, some with respect. But right now she wasn't a story. She was a person, hurt and barely breathing. Luke knelt beside her carefully. "Hey there," he said softly, his voice gentle. "You're all right. You just need some water." He pulled his canteen and lifted it toward her lips, letting a few drops fall. Her eyelids fluttered and she made a faint sound. A whisper he couldn't understand. He didn't know what had happened to her, and he didn't need to. All he knew was that leaving her there wasn't something he could do. So with slow, careful movements, he lifted her into his arms. She was light, fragile like a bird. He carried her to a shaded spot beneath a rock ledge where the wind couldn't reach. For the next few hours, Luke stayed beside her, tending to her quietly. He washed the dust from her face with the little water he had and covered her with his jacket. She had a small pouch tied to her waist, filled with herbs and dried leaves. He didn't touch it, but guessed it was medicine. He thought about what to do next. He couldn't take her to town. People there wouldn't understand. He also couldn't leave her alone in the desert. As the day turned into night, the girl stirred and opened her eyes. They were deep brown, calm, yet filled with pain. She looked at him for a long moment before whispering a few words in Apache. Luke didn't understand, but he smiled gently. "You're safe," he said, pointing to himself. "Luke." Then he pointed to her questioningly. She hesitated, then whispered, "Ayana." Her voice was soft but carried a quiet strength. Luke nodded. "Ayana," he repeated carefully. She gave a faint nod, understanding that he meant no harm. Over the next few days, he stayed near that same rocky shelter, nursing her back to strength. She ate little, mostly the dry beans and jerky he carried and sometimes herbs from her pouch. In the evenings, they sat by a small campfire. She taught him a few Apache words, names of the stars, the wind, and the earth. He listened more than he spoke, and though they shared few words, they understood each other in silence. Luke began to notice how differently she looked at the land. To him, the desert had always been harsh and empty. but to Ayanna it was alive. She would close her eyes and listen to the sound of the wind passing through the rocks. "It speaks," she told him once, touching her hand to the sand. Luke didn't laugh or question her. Instead, he watched her with quiet respect, realizing how little he truly knew about the world he had spent his life riding through. One evening, as the sun melted into the horizon, painting the sky with orange and pink, Luke asked softly, "Where's your home?" She pointed toward the mountains in the distance. "My people," she said simply. Luke nodded. He knew he would have to take her back soon. The thought made his chest feel heavy for reasons he couldn't explain. He had spent so many years alone that he'd almost forgotten what it felt like to care for someone, even a stranger, but now he did. When Ayanna was strong enough to walk again, Luke helped her mount Dusty, and they began the journey toward the mountains. The path was long and quiet, filled with the hum of crickets and the whisper of the wind. Sometimes Ayanna would hum a soft tune, a melody that seemed older than time itself. It calmed Luke's wandering thoughts. After a day's ride, they reached the edge of the Apache territory. Luke stopped there, unsure what would happen next. He knew that her people might not welcome him. But before he could say anything, Ayanna looked at him and smiled gently. "You saved me," she said in careful English. "You have good heart." Luke didn't know what to say. He just nodded, tipping his hat slightly. "You take care now, Ayanna." She stepped down from the horse and turned toward the rocks ahead. Within moments, several figures appeared, men from her tribe watching silently. Luke felt a knot form in his stomach, but Ayanna lifted her hand, a sign of peace. The men spoke to her quickly in their language, their expressions softening as she explained. Finally, one of the elders, a man with wise eyes and silver hair, walked toward Luke. He studied him for a long moment, then said in slow, accented English, "You gave life. You have paid old debt." Luke didn't understand what that meant, but he could feel the weight in the man's words. He simply nodded again. The elder placed his hand on Luke's shoulder, then turned away with Ayanna. She glanced back once, her smile small but full of meaning. As Luke rode away, the desert stretched before him once again, endless, quiet, and golden. But something had changed. For the first time, he didn't feel alone. He didn't know it yet, but that moment, saving Ayanna, earning the trust of her people, would become the beginning of a story much bigger than gold. The desert wind carried the faint sound of her song behind him, soft and fading into the horizon. Luke smiled under his hat. He had come looking for treasure in the earth, but what he found instead was something no map could lead him to. A reminder that even in the loneliest places, kindness could bloom like a wild desert flower. The days after Luke left the Apache lands felt unusually quiet. The desert that had once seemed endless and lonely now seemed to hold echoes of a voice he couldn't forget. Sometimes, while setting up camp or pouring coffee into a tin cup, he would hear the soft hum of Ayanna's song in his memory. It was strange, he thought, how someone could come into your life for such a short time and yet stay in your heart like a shadow that never fades. Luke tried to keep his mind on his journey. He rode from one small settlement to another, offering to mend fences, herd cattle, or drive wagons for a few coins. He didn't stay anywhere long enough to call it home. There was always a road calling him elsewhere. Yet wherever he went, he carried a quiet peace he hadn't felt before. One night, in a dusty mining town called Dry Creek, Luke sat in a small saloon, sipping a cup of bitter coffee. The place smelled of tobacco and sweat, and the piano in the corner played a tired tune. Men around him talked loudly about gold, always gold. They spoke of a hidden canyon far east, deep in Apache country, where gold veins were said to run through the rock like frozen sunlight. Luke froze at the words. A hidden canyon deep in Apache land, it reminded him of what the elder had said that day. "You have paid old debt." At the time, he hadn't understood. But now, sitting in that noisy saloon, he wondered if that debt was connected to the stories about the canyon. He didn't believe in coincidences, not out here in the desert. As the crowd thinned out, an older man with a scar across his cheek sat beside Luke. He spoke in a low voice. "You look like someone who's seen the desert's secrets." Luke smiled faintly. "Maybe. Or maybe I just got lost in them." The man laughed softly. "Well, if you ever want to find something worth keeping, head north of the San Carlos Hills. There's an old story about a canyon where the earth itself glows with gold. but only those with pure hearts can find it. Others, he added, shaking his head, never come back. Luke didn't reply, but the words stayed with him long after the man had gone. That night, under the stars, he couldn't sleep. The thought of the canyon filled his mind. He remembered Ayana's people, their quiet dignity, their deep connection to the land. Maybe the canyon wasn't just about gold. Maybe it was something sacred, something that couldn't be measured in dollars or weight. Days turned into weeks, and fate, as it often does, found a way to circle back. One late afternoon, Luke was repairing a broken wagon wheel on a trail not far from the same mountains where he had left Ayana. As he worked, he noticed a figure approaching slowly on horseback. The rider's long, dark hair caught the sunlight. It was her, Ayana. She rode closer, smiling shyly. "You remember me," she said softly. Luke couldn't help but smile back. "Hard to forget the one who taught me that the wind can speak." Ayana laughed gently, her eyes sparkling. "My people saw you leave. The elder said your path and mine are not finished yet." Luke tilted his head. "And what does that mean?" She dismounted and reached into her saddlebag, pulling out a small leather pouch. Inside it was a smooth stone painted with symbols. "This," she said, "is from my grandfather. He said you have spirit of the land in your heart. He told me to show you something." She motioned for him to follow, and together they rode toward the hills. The sun was setting, painting the desert gold and orange. After an hour's ride, they stopped at the mouth of a canyon Luke had never seen before. The walls were high and glowing faintly in the dying light, as though the sun itself had hidden pieces of its soul inside the rocks. "This is the place," Ayana said softly. "My people call it Canyon of Promise. Only those who come with honest hearts can enter and leave safely." Luke dismounted slowly, awe in his eyes. "It's beautiful," he murmured. Ayana nodded. "It is not just stone and sand. It is a memory of our people, a place of dreams. Long ago, one of your ancestors helped one of ours. He protected our people when the world was cruel. My grandfather says the spirit of that promise lives in you. You saved me, Luke. You completed that circle." Her words struck him deeply. "So that's the debt the elder spoke about." She smiled gently. "Yes, the old promise. Life returning life." Luke looked around the canyon walls, running his fingers along the smooth stone. "And the gold?" he asked quietly. Ayana hesitated. "There is gold in this canyon, yes. But it belongs to the earth. Those who try to take it for greed will never find peace. The gold is a test of the heart." Luke nodded slowly, understanding more than he could explain. He wasn't sure if he believed in curses or blessings, but he did believe in balance, and the desert had its own kind of justice. They spent the night near the canyon's entrance. The fire crackled softly between them. Ayana shared dried corn cakes and herbs from her pouch. Luke told her stories about life on the trail, of nights spent under lightning storms, of lonely ranches, of the way the stars seemed closer when you had no roof above you. Ayana listened with quiet curiosity. "You have lived with the land like us," she said. "But you chase gold instead of peace," Luke chuckled. "Maybe peace doesn't pay as well," she smiled knowingly. "Peace is not something to buy. It is something you carry." Those words lingered in his mind long after she had fallen asleep beside the fire. He stared up at the stars, feeling small beneath their endless light. Maybe he had spent too long chasing the wrong kind of treasure. When morning came, Ayana led him deeper into the canyon. They walked side by side as the rising sun lit up the walls with brilliant color, red, gold, and amber. The air was still, yet it seemed to hum with quiet life. Luke felt something stir inside him, something peaceful and strong. At one point, Ayana knelt and touched the earth. "Here," she said, pointing to a pattern of stones. "This is where my people come to pray, to thank the land for what it gives." Luke knelt beside her, uncertain what to do. But when he placed his hand on the ground, he felt warmth. Not from the sun, but from within the earth itself. It was like touching the heartbeat of the world. In that moment, he understood what she meant when she said the land was alive. It wasn't just dirt and rock, it was history, spirit, and life all woven together. They stayed in the canyon for 2 days. Ayana showed him where the wildflowers grew even in the driest soil, and where birds nested high in the cliffs. She explained how her people took only what they needed and gave thanks for every gift. Luke listened, learning more about life in those 2 days than he had in all his years of wandering. When it was time to leave, Ayana gave him the painted stone again. "Keep it," she said. "It will remind you that your heart is stronger than gold." Luke took it gently. "I'll remember." he promised. They said goodbye at the edge of the canyon. Luke watched her ride back toward the mountains, her figure growing smaller with every step. He felt something shift inside him, a mix of gratitude and sorrow. For the first time, he wasn't thinking about gold. He was thinking about promises, about the quiet bond that connected him to the land and to a girl who saw beauty where others saw emptiness. That night, as he camped under a blanket of stars, Luke pulled the stone from his pocket. It glowed faintly in the firelight. He smiled, realizing that maybe his real fortune wasn't buried in the ground. It was already in his hands, in his heart, and in the simple peace that comes when you stop running from yourself. The desert wind whispered softly through the sage, carrying her voice like a lullaby. Luke leaned back, closed his eyes, and let it sing him to sleep. After leaving the canyon, Luke McAllister rode for many days through the open plains. The wind was calm, the sun warm on his shoulders, and the world seemed quieter than before. In his pocket, the painted stone Ayanna had given him was always there, like a promise he couldn't forget. For a while, life felt easier. He worked odd jobs on small ranches, helped travelers fix their wagons, and stayed out of trouble. Every evening, when the sun dipped low and turned the desert gold, he would think of Ayanna's words. Peace is not something to buy. It is something you carry. But peace, like water in the desert, can slip through your fingers if you're not careful. One evening, while Luke was helping drive cattle near a small town called Silver Flats, he stopped at the local saloon for a drink. The place buzzed with chatter and laughter. Cards slapped against tables, boots thudded on the wooden floor, and voices rose in half-drunken cheer. Luke sat quietly at a corner table, sipping black coffee instead of whiskey. He preferred his head clear. Across the room, two men were talking loudly about a new gold find. They say it's near the San Carlos Hills, one said. A canyon full of golden rock. The kind no one's ever touched. Luke's hand froze on his cup. He looked up sharply. San Carlos Hills, the same place where the Canyon of Promise rested. His heart began to thump. The second man laughed. Some say it's Apache land. But gold's gold, and I don't see no name carved on it. Luke looked away, unease spreading in his chest. He had promised Ayanna never to seek the canyon for greed, but the sound of those words, gold's gold, echoed in his head. He had debts from his past, small ones maybe, but enough to haunt him. A few mistakes, a few bad games of cards, a few wrong friends. The idea of paying it all off once and for all tempted him more than he wanted to admit. That night he lay awake under the stars outside town, staring at the painted stone in his palm. The colors shimmered faintly in the moonlight. Just one look, he whispered to himself. If the gold's really there, maybe I can take a little, just enough to start over. The desert stayed silent, offering no answer. 2 days later, Luke saddled Dusty and rode east. His mind told him it was foolish, but his heart was restless. The closer he got to the canyon, the heavier his chest felt. When he finally reached the familiar red cliffs, the wind was whispering through the rocks as if warning him to turn back. He dismounted and walked slowly toward the mouth of the canyon. The same warmth that had once comforted him now felt distant. The air was still, almost watchful. But when he reached the inner wall, something caught his eye, a faint golden shimmer along the stone. He brushed away a layer of sand and saw it clearly, a thin vein of gold winding through the rock like sunlight trapped inside the earth. For a long time, he simply stared. It was beautiful, pure, untamed, and glowing softly even in the shade. The kind of sight that could make a man forget everything else. He knelt down, pulled out his small pickaxe, and hesitated. Just a little, he told himself again. Just enough to square things. He began to chip gently at the stone, his heartbeat quickening. Every strike echoed through the canyon, ringing like a bell. Dust fell around him in golden clouds. The more he worked, the more he wanted to keep going. The gold gleamed brighter with every piece he loosened. Hours passed before he finally stopped. He had filled a small pouch with pieces of the golden ore. His hands trembled as he looked at it. It didn't feel right. The pouch felt heavier than it should, like it carried more than just gold. That night, Luke made camp near the canyon's edge. He couldn't sleep. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw Ayanna's face, calm and kind, and heard her say, "The gold is a test of the heart." He sighed, turning the pouch in his hands. "I'll make it right," he muttered. I'll come back and put it all back when I can. But fate often has its own plans. At dawn, the sound of hooves broke the silence. Luke looked up sharply. Ayanna stood at the canyon's entrance, her dark hair braided neatly, her eyes filled with sadness. She must have seen him from afar or followed the signs of his trail. "You came back," she said softly. Luke got to his feet. "Ayanna, She looked down at the ground. "You took from the canyon." He opened his mouth to explain but stopped. The words wouldn't come. There was no excuse that could sound right. Ayanna stepped closer. "This place is not just earth and stone. It is alive. When someone takes with greed, the balance breaks." Her voice was calm, not angry, but it carried a weight that pierced deeper than anger ever could. Luke dropped his gaze. "I didn't mean to harm anything. I just needed a way to start over." Ayanna looked at him for a long time. "You cannot start over by taking what does not belong to you. The land gives to those who listen, not to those who demand." He nodded slowly. "I understand now. I'll return it," she smiled faintly. "It is not gold the land asks for. It is honesty." Luke reached into his saddlebag, took out the pouch of gold, and placed it gently at her feet. The golden dust shimmered in the morning light. Ayanna knelt beside it, whispering words in her language, soft, melodic like a prayer. When she finished, she stood and looked at him. "The land will forgive, but only if your heart does too." Luke felt something loosen inside his chest, a deep, aching guilt lifting slowly away. "I don't know how to thank you," he said quietly. "You already did once," she replied. "You saved my life. Now you saved your own heart." The two of them stood in silence for a while, watching the sun climb higher over the canyon walls. The light spilled over the rocks, turning them from gold to rose to soft orange. It was like the earth itself was breathing again. After a long moment, Ayanna spoke again. "You cannot take the gold, but you can take its lesson. That is more precious." Luke smiled faintly. "And what lesson is that?" She met his gaze. "That the richest hearts are those that give." He nodded slowly, letting the words sink deep. The weight of greed, fear, and longing that had sat on his shoulders for years finally began to fade. He realized he didn't want gold anymore. He wanted meaning, something he'd only ever found in her presence. As the day went on, Ayanna showed him how her people honored the canyon. They left small stones and feathers as gifts of respect. Luke followed her lead, placing the painted stone she had given him at the foot of the golden wall. "To keep the balance," he whispered. Ayanna smiled. "The land remembers." That evening, before parting, she handed him a small wooden charm shaped like a bird. "When you feel lost," she said, "listen to the wind. It carries truth better than gold ever can." Luke looked at her, unsure what to say. "You've got more wisdom than most preachers I've met." She laughed softly. "The desert teaches those who are quiet." When she rode away, the canyon seemed to hum again, peaceful this time, not angry. Luke watched her disappear beyond the hills, feeling lighter than he had in years. He mounted Dusty and rode west, not with gold in his pockets, but with something far more valuable, a heart free of greed and a soul at peace. That night, under the stars, Luke built a small fire. The air was cool, the sky endless. He held the wooden bird in his hands and whispered, "You were right, Ayanna. Peace isn't something you buy, it's something you carry." The flames flickered gently and the desert wind sang through the rocks. For the first time, Luke didn't dream of gold or fortune. He dreamed of open skies, quiet songs, and the smile of a girl who had taught him that some treasures are meant not to be taken, but to be understood. The days turned slower after Luke left the canyon. The land seemed softer somehow, as if the desert itself had forgiven him. He felt lighter now, though his pockets were empty. The small wooden bird Ayanna had given him hung from his saddle, swaying with every movement of his horse. Sometimes when the wind blew, it made a faint sound like a tiny flute. It reminded him of her voice, calm, honest, and full of peace. Luke traveled from place to place, working wherever he could. He fixed fences for ranchers, helped gather cattle, and sometimes just rode through the wide, empty lands with no destination at all. He didn't care about gold anymore. What he wanted now was something far more quiet and lasting, a life that meant something good. But the desert remembers everything, and not all men see it the same way Luke did. One morning, as Luke watered Dusty near a small creek, he noticed fresh hoofprints in the mud, many of them. The marks looked hurried, heavy. A chill ran through him. The tracks led toward the direction of the Apache lands. Something in his heart told him trouble was coming. He followed the trail for a while until he saw dust rising in the distance. A group of riders, strangers, were heading straight toward the canyon. He knew instantly what they were after. Someone must have heard the old stories again, just as he had before. For a moment, Luke thought about turning away. It wasn't his business anymore. But then he remembered Ayana's smile, the trust in her eyes, and the peace her people had shown him. He couldn't let greed and ignorance disturb their sacred place. Not again. He turned Dusty toward the canyon and rode fast. The sun beat down on his back, and the wind carried the dry scent of dust and rock. He didn't know what he could do, only that he had to try. When he reached the outer rim of the canyon, he saw Ayana standing near the rocks. Her face was calm, but her eyes were worried. She looked at him as if she had been expecting him all along. "You felt it too," she said softly. Luke nodded. "There are men coming. They're after the gold." Ayana closed her eyes for a moment. "The land will protect itself," she said quietly. "But hearts must still choose." Luke didn't understand at first, but her words made him steady. He knew he had to help somehow, to stand with her people, not because of any reward, but because it was right. Together they walked to the canyon's edge. The air felt different that day, thick, almost humming with energy. The same golden light that once shone peacefully on the rocks now flickered restlessly, as if the canyon knew danger was near. Ayana gathered a few others from her tribe, men and women who carried wisdom, not weapons. They began to hum softly, a low song that echoed off the canyon walls. It wasn't a song of fear, but of strength and balance. Luke stood nearby, quietly listening. The melody seemed to blend with the wind, flowing through every crack in the stone. When the group of riders arrived, they stopped at a distance, shouting to each other as they looked around the canyon walls. Their laughter was loud and careless. Luke recognized that sound. It was the sound of men who thought the world owed them something. He didn't go near them, but he watched from behind the rocks as the strangers searched. They didn't find the gold they wanted. Instead, the canyon began to shift. Loose sand fell from the cliffs and a deep rumble filled the air. Not frightening, but powerful, like the earth was sighing. The strangers looked uneasy. The land itself seemed to warn them, whispering that they should leave. Luke turned to Ayana. "What's happening?" She didn't look afraid. The canyon remembers kindness. It also remembers greed. The wind rose, circling through the canyon like a living thing. Dust swirled in patterns that looked almost like golden ribbons. The riders stopped shouting. Their voices faded into silence. Slowly they turned and left, the sound of their horses fading into the distance. When the last of them disappeared beyond the hills, the air grew still again. The golden light softened. It felt like the canyon had taken a deep breath and gone back to sleep. Ayana looked at Luke, her eyes gentle. "Balance is kept," she said. He nodded, relief washing over him. "I guess the land really doesn't need much help from men like me." She smiled. "Maybe not, but it still needs hearts that care." They walked down into the canyon together. The golden walls glowed softly in the late afternoon light. Ayana touched one of the smooth stones as they passed. "Long ago," she said, "the spirits placed gold here not to tempt men, but to remind them that beauty can blind if you forget to see with your heart." Luke listened quietly. Every word she spoke felt like truth carved into the wind. As the sun dipped lower, they reached the same spot where he had once taken the gold. A small patch of earth there now shimmered faintly, almost as if it had healed itself. Luke knelt down and pressed his hand to the ground. It felt warm, alive. "I'm sorry," he whispered, "for not understanding sooner." Ayana knelt beside him. "The earth forgives those who listen," she said softly. They sat there for a while, saying nothing. The silence between them was peaceful, not heavy. Luke looked up at the sky. It was painted in shades of pink and orange, with the first stars beginning to peek through. "You ever think about leaving this place?" he asked after a while. Ayana smiled faintly. "The desert is my home. But home is not just a place, it is where your spirit is calm. You have found yours too." Luke nodded, knowing she was right. His spirit finally felt calm, something he never thought possible. That night they camped near the canyon entrance. The tribe shared food, laughter, and quiet songs around the fire. Luke felt at home among them, though he said little. He watched the stars twinkle above, brighter than he had ever seen them. Before they slept, Ayanna sat beside him. "You have changed," she said softly. Luke chuckled. "Guess I finally stopped running from myself." She looked at him thoughtfully. "You were never running away. You were just looking for the right road," he smiled. "And you helped me find it." Ayanna shook her head gently. "You found it because your heart was ready." They said goodnight, and Luke lay awake long after everyone else had fallen asleep. The desert air was cool, the night silent except for the soft rustle of the wind. He thought about everything that had happened, from the first day he found her wounded in the sand, to this quiet night where peace finally rested between them. When dawn came, the world glowed gold again, but this time Luke didn't think of riches. He thought of promise, of the beauty that comes when a person learns to live in harmony with the land, with others and with themselves. Before he left, Ayanna gave him a small pouch filled with desert sage and a single golden feather. "For your journey," she said, "a reminder that even the lightest things can guide you when the path is unclear." Luke tied the pouch to his saddle and smiled. "You always know what a man needs, don't you?" She laughed softly. "Only what his heart asks for." As he rode away, the canyon behind him shimmered in the rising sun. The wind carried the sound of distant singing, the tribe's morning prayer thanking the land for another day. Luke listened until it faded, then touched the small wooden bird hanging from his saddle. He whispered quietly, "Thank you, Ayanna. Thank you for showing me what gold really means." And for the first time in his life, Luke McAllister felt truly rich, not with money but with peace, kindness, and the warmth of a promise kept by both man and earth. The desert stretched before him, endless and bright, and somewhere deep inside, the song of the canyon continued, soft, strong, and eternal. Months passed after Luke McAllister left the Canyon of Promise. The days rolled by like quiet waves of sand, each sunrise gentle and each sunset golden. Luke rode across open lands where the sky stretched forever, and the stars came out like lanterns scattered across heaven. He still worked when he needed to, mending fences, herding cattle, fixing wagons, but life no longer felt like a chase. He wasn't searching for gold anymore. He was learning to live slowly, to see beauty in simple things. Sometimes, when he camped under the stars, he would take out the small wooden bird Ayanna had carved for him. Its smooth surface was worn now from being in his hand so often. He would look at it, smile softly, and whisper to himself, "Peace is something you carry." Those words had become his way of living. One late afternoon, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, Luke stopped near a small town called Clearwater Springs. It was a peaceful place, a few wooden houses, a general store, and a small church that rang its bell every evening. Children ran through the dusty street, chasing each other with laughter that sounded like wind chimes. Luke tied Dusty outside the local inn and walked in. The innkeeper greeted him warmly. "You look like you've been traveling a while, friend." "Long enough," Luke said with a small grin. "Just looking for a place to rest and maybe a warm meal." "Got both right here," the innkeeper said, handing him a bowl of stew. "You a rancher?" "Something like that," Luke replied. He didn't tell many stories about himself these days. He preferred to listen. That night, after eating, he sat on the porch outside the inn watching the stars rise. The town was quiet, with only the sound of crickets and the distant hoot of an owl. As he sat there, a gentle breeze blew across his face. It carried with it the faint smell of sage and sand, reminding him of the canyon, of the desert, and of Ayanna. A few days later, while helping a local farmer fix a windmill, Luke met a young boy named Eli. The boy had big brown eyes full of curiosity and a quick smile. He followed Luke everywhere, asking questions about horses, the desert, and the life of a cowboy. "Is it true," Eli asked one afternoon, "that there's gold out there in the desert?" Luke looked at the boy, smiled kindly, and said, "Maybe there is, son. But the real treasure isn't what shines in the sand. It's what you find inside yourself." Eli frowned, trying to understand. "Inside? Like what?" "Like courage," Luke said. "Kindness. Peace. Those things are harder to find than gold, but once you do, they never leave you." The boy thought for a moment, then smiled. "Then I guess you already found your treasure." Luke chuckled softly. "Maybe I did." Life in Clearwater Springs moved slowly, and for the first time Luke stayed in one place longer than a few days. He helped the townsfolk, fixed fences, and even taught Eli how to ride Dusty. People began to trust him, though they didn't know much about where he'd come from. He didn't talk about his past or the canyon, but sometimes when he looked toward the horizon, a quiet longing filled his eyes. One evening, while Luke was sitting outside watching the sun melt into the desert, he saw a figure riding toward the town. As the rider came closer, he felt his breath catch. It was Ayanna. She wore a light shawl, her long dark hair braided neatly, and her face glowed softly in the fading sunlight. He stood up, unable to hide his surprise. "Ayanna, I didn't think I'd see you again," she smiled, her eyes warm. "The wind carries news, Luke. I heard of a cowboy who teaches children instead of chasing gold. I thought it might be you." Luke laughed quietly. "You always had a way of finding me." "I don't find," she said. "I follow the wind, and it leads where hearts are true." They sat together by the edge of town, watching the sky turn from orange to purple. The years hadn't changed her much. She still had the same calm strength, the same kindness in her eyes. "How's the canyon?" Luke asked softly. "It is safe," she said. "The land remembers those who respect it. My people still sing to it every morning." Luke nodded, smiling. "I miss that sound." "You can hear it anywhere," she said, placing her hand on her heart. "It's the same song inside you." They talked long into the night about the desert, about the people who had come and gone, about dreams and memories. Luke told her about Eli and the peaceful life he had found in the small town. Ayanna listened, her eyes full of quiet pride. "You have found balance," she said. "That is what the canyon wanted for you." Luke looked down, his voice soft. "Maybe I didn't deserve all the kindness I got." Ayanna shook her head. "Kindness is not something you earn. It is something you share. You gave your heart to the desert, and it gave you peace in return." For a long while they sat in silence, the night air cool around them. The moon rose high, silvering the landscape. Luke realized how deeply connected he still felt to her, not in a way that needed words or promises, but in quiet understanding. When morning came, Ayanna prepared to leave. Her people were waiting beyond the hills, and she could not stay. Luke walked with her to the edge of town. "I'll never forget what you taught me," he said. She smiled. "You don't need to remember, Luke. You are already living it." He nodded slowly. "Do you think we'll meet again?" Ayanna looked toward the horizon where the sun was rising. "Maybe not in this life," she said softly. "But the desert is wide and the spirit never forgets. Wherever the wind sings, we will meet again." She mounted her horse, turned to look at him one last time, and said, "You promised me gold once, but you gave me something far greater. Your heart. That is a treasure that will never fade." Luke's throat tightened. "And you gave me peace. That's more than gold, too." She smiled, nodded gently, and rode away into the golden light. Luke watched her until she disappeared beyond the dunes, her figure blending with the horizon. He stood there for a long time, the morning sun warming his face, the sound of the wind whispering through the sagebrush. It carried her voice soft as ever. "Peace is something you carry." Years later, people in Clearwater Springs still spoke about Luke McAllister. They said he was a quiet man who helped everyone, who never spoke of his past but always had a smile for anyone in need. Some said he used to be a gold hunter. Others said he was a wanderer who had found something better than treasure. And sometimes, on warm evenings, travelers passing through would claim to see him sitting by the edge of town, looking out at the desert, a small wooden bird resting in his hands, a peaceful smile on his face. They said that when the wind blew across the plains just right, it carried the faint sound of a song, a woman's voice, gentle and timeless, singing through the golden air. And in that moment, the desert itself seemed alive again, whispering the same story it had always told, that true wealth is not found in the earth, but in the hearts of those who love it, that promises kept with kindness never fade, and that somewhere beyond the horizon, where the sun meets the sand, a cowboy and an Apache girl will always ride together, free, peaceful, and eternal as the desert wind.